Guys, I hope everyone's all right this morning. Thanks very much for joining us on this webinar. Now, I know the title was 5 Steps to a Successful Cloud Adoption, but actually when we were writing it, there was more than 5. So we decided to put more than 5 in, and I hope that's okay. So there's a few tips in there, there's a few myths in there, there's the things that we've learnt, and I'd just like to share that with you this morning. If any of you are embarking on a cloud project, specifically with somebody like Microsoft Azure, and you're looking at something that's on your strategy for the next couple of years, whatever that may be, hopefully you'll take 1 or 2 things away from today that should help you on that journey. So I'm Andy, I'm the CTO of A&S. I look after solution architecture and strategy for A&S. I look after all the teams that are doing cloud migrations and cloud builds and cloud development. It's a really, really big area for us now. And like I say, thanks very much for joining us again this morning. We'll get cracking. So I didn't want to start with why cloud really, because you'll get that from the cloud providers and it'll land in your inbox every single day. I think what I'd like to share is what have we seen from the projects that we've done recently. What are the motivators? So digital is a big one. You probably all know that. But really interesting, not just moving virtual machines to cloud and running them in there, which is effectively just a rehost. People building brand new applications on the cloud services that make it really easy to consume things like machine learning. We see a little bit of blockchain now starting to appear in certain verticals. So, for example, Microsoft Azure offers a full private blockchain application design, build and management, which is really interesting. A couple of years ago, that was an absolute nightmare to create yourself. Machine learning as a subset of artificial intelligence is something that's really starting to get some traction in the big data field. Loads and loads of cloud services, things that you just couldn't build yourself in a traditional application environment that you can now just build into an API and give such a richer experience for a user, consumer or customer. Some of the things that you can use now cloud for is absolutely phenomenal. So when we talk about digital, new applications, cloud native applications built on some of these cloud native APIs that allow you to take advantage of all these new services. Data center zero is still there. I don't want to do cloud native. I'm not that fussed about digital. I just want to get rid of real estate. How many of my apps could I move? I'm maybe looking at a local hoster who's maybe got some form of VMware platform I can move them to, or actually, I'm looking to actually decommission data centers, maybe a healthcare trust with 10, 11, 12, 13 data centers, maybe looking to get down to 2 for just some key on-prem. There's a lot of NHS apps that still aren't really good candidates for cloud, but what can I move there? Where can I get my smallest footprint? How do I get out of the real estate business? And although that's, it's unfair to say that not everybody's looking at it from a digital perspective, the key driver for some is coming out of real estate. There's one large healthcare trust we're working with at the minute that is absolutely the driver. Shifting ops capability, want to get out of the traditional stuff, want to get out of provisioning hardware. How do we get ourselves into a position of offering more value further up the stack? And the one that always comes up, is it cheaper? Is it more efficient? What gains can we gain by maybe moving our systems or rebuilding our systems in cloud? So there's just a bit of a, from our assessment team, what some of the drivers are. So there's never just one, there's a few. They're all important, but there's a few, there's always a leading driver that is one of the things that sort of sparks the adoption. And the first tip I'd like to say is there's a lot of people out there that have not actually, they've never done a cloud migration or even spoken in detail or done an assessment, but there's always this presumption about certain things, whether it not be secure, whether it be expensive, whether it be like this or like that. And I think the first thing is open-mindedness when you go into a project is probably the most key thing. We deal with a lot of customers who say, no, we've worked it all out, it'd be really expensive for us to do it. And actually, it's just sometimes not true. That there's not really a big, there's not an assessment that's happened or somebody with some expertise. It's a feeling. It's something that they've heard at maybe a hardware vendor's kickoff or a keynote or something like that that's maybe put them off. But in reality, the key thing with cloud is just not to presume anything before you start. Always find out the facts, because there's a lot of myths and there's a lot of things flying out there that, number one, are just not true in our experience. And people always go into it with some bias. And that might be operational bias, that you like things the way they are or whatever that may be, but presuming something is actually one of the biggest challenges. Just continuing with BAU is one of the biggest challenges to cloud adoption. So I would always say try and be open-minded and don't presume anything. The first one I want to debunk really is a myth that cloud is expensive. Now, it's interesting because there are certain use cases where it's expensive and certain use cases where it's cheap. Netting out, though, across all our projects, specifically at the minute, cloud is working out cheaper. Definitely. If you're 100% realistic about what you actually have and what you spend on-prem, and you factor it in properly using, you know, the right kind of industry standard tooling and the right kind of methodologies with working out showback, chargeback of what you're paying at the minute, incorporating licensing, FTE models, cost per square foot of data, and you go all in and you do it properly, the general market rule from the people who have done it and the people who are all in on cloud, the early adopters, are saying it's netting out about 30% cheaper. The ones that work out to be more expensive, unfortunately, have done a full lift and shift of what they've got, moved it into cloud, and they've not re-architected, or they've not done any optimization or efficiency engineering on the way in. I'm going to talk about that shortly, but that's something that we're speaking from experience there, really. The organisation is saying this is really expensive. I mean, there's one organisation at the minute, public sector organisation we work with, where we've just pretty much halved the bill. So cloud migration, all in, really expensive, been done pretty, you know, not without the best assessment. There's no optimization. It was just a full lift and shift. Within 3 months of taking that on, we've managed to halve the bill, just by re-engineering and refactoring and using cloud operations. So the myth that it's expensive is typically from people who are trying to protect existing revenue streams or existing operational models, or are just on a straightforward lift and shift. And yeah, it can be if it's done in that way, definitely. But the general rule of thumb is that I would debunk this one, and I would argue the toss there quite aggressively on our experience. And the reason for it, I just want to touch a little bit more on that, is there's a big operational shift in cloud. And I think this cost one is a real one to spend a bit of time on, because it's one of the first ones that comes out. If you have a look at sort of some of your operational capability today, you know, you've probably got a team of virtual architects, storage architects, infrastructure architects, whatever you may call them. And they typically design for stability. They're always designing for risk. You know, if a virtual machine or an application needs 16 gig of RAM, they'll give it 32 because you bought it and CapExed it and it's looking at you in the data center, so why not use it? Manages everything via a GUI, you know, logging into virtual machine interfaces and storage interfaces and fabrics and all those kind of different tooling that we buy when we integrate on-prem infrastructure together. Very focused on the virtual machine. You know, typically infrastructure architects are everything wrapped around the VM. And typically over provisions capacity. You know, if it needs 1,000 IOPS, we give it 2,000 IOPS. You know, if it needs X amount of RAM, we give it a little bit more. If it needs X CPU, we give it a bit more, because it's usually bought and paid for. You know, the economics is usually a 36 or a 60-month depreciation. We buy everything up front and buy too much on the day, usually because of vendor discounts. If you have a set of tooling that you've probably been using, you know, things like vRealize Operations or SolarWinds or some kind of Microsoft System Center, whatever that may be, HP tooling, Cisco tooling, and your disaster recovery and your business continuity is always, you know, N+1, grid, whatever that may be, but buying everything twice, you know, data replication done at snapshots, and when you basically need to get something back, you recover the full stack. So it's all about, you know, getting that VM and getting that data back through some kind of backup tooling. And when you move into cloud, it's key to understand, and A&S has two different teams for this exact purpose. We have virtual architects that do all the converged infrastructure and the hyper-converged infrastructure that does focus around the virtual machine, where that is the center of the world. But when you sort of move into new world operations, cloud architects are very, very, very different. They're very, very focused on designing for efficiency. So they'll never do anything that's too good for the job on purpose. Everything's automated and managed by a script, so everything's a one-click rebuild. You know, you script yourself around certain things in the cloud that makes operations a lot easier, a lot more bespoke, a lot more custom to you. It's all about the platform and the application architecture, because you can build the same application in cloud 20 different ways. One might cost you 10,000 a month, one might cost you 25 quid. It really is as simple as that. When you actually look at the application architecture, there's so many different ways that you could build it, so many different ways you could architect it if you actually think outside of the virtual machine, because cloud is all about applications, it's all about direct APIs. And when you start to just talk about lifting and shifting and rehosting virtual machines in there, that's when it can get expensive. And there's a permanent operational function of right-sizing. You are always tuning and trimming all the way in the cloud. The economics, that rolls onto economics, very different. You know, you're talking that everything's just-in-time provisioned, everything's tagged, everything's lined to a cost center. Do shut things down if they're not being used, and this doesn't necessarily mean that you'd shut something down for 16 hours of the day. It might just be for 4 hours during the night when you see that absolutely no one's on it, but you do that across 30, 40 applications, it absolutely helps. Development machines, disaster recovery machines, everything goes off. It's a big part of our operations on our managed services operations, which is, you know, making sure that we've got perfectly tuned sequences for certain applications because they don't need to be up if no one's going to use them. So getting that application DNA and working out what the usage times are, who uses it, when could actually, even if it's off for an hour, you know, that could save £30, £40. It adds up across 40, 50 applications across a month. It's a big part of cloud architecture operations that you just wouldn't do with virtual machines. Tooling's very different. There's so much brilliant tooling out there, you know, Chef Compliance Manager and desired state configuration tooling to manage drift control of all your applications. You're starting to see containerized applications now with things like Docker, which are really nice and light, boot quite fast. So, you know, you start to see this sort of refactoring or remodernizing an old application and packaging it up into a container so it runs very light and very cheap. That's a certainly big area for Microsoft on application modernization. Alert Logic being one of the great cloud managed defense and response capabilities, so what next generation security looks like with embedded ML and AI. Really, really great service there that you buy an OpEx on, lay it over the top of your cloud platform, really good insights, great products. So you start to see some of these things. Then disaster recovery, you know, we start to see customers using things like chaos engines now, which was a big pioneering piece of Netflix, really good at scale, not as much at smaller scale, but different kinds of ways of working out disaster recovery, building ephemeral instances, worrying about where application state is and can we design that out, and making sure we're in a position of just complete automated rebuilds. You know, there isn't really a DR as such where everything replicates at a timed instance. You have a full automated build of the whole application stack and it's data from maybe a blob store or some kind of storage service on demand. So you're not really always managing DR. DR is a virtual script that effectively, you know, builds everything on demand in a cloud-native way. And it's a completely different mindset and a completely different way of thinking. And back to the cost argument, if you sort of have virtual architects and virtual mindset, this first mindset which you've got on this operational shift here, building in the cloud world, that is something that we see quite a lot that makes it quite expensive, that if you don't have the right cloud architecture skills and, you know, people are treating Azure, for example, as an ESX as VMware, then, yeah, you're going to end up with it being quite expensive. It's not designed to be used in that way, but the outcome is exactly the same. So just using a quick application example then, you know, you've got a typical front-end IS servers, app servers, and a SQL cluster, typical 3-tier, everybody's got hundreds of them, quite standard. You know, you kind of take your standard build, as you'll see there. I'll send these slides out later if anyone wants to go and dive into this in a bit more detail. You know, be my guest, it's cool. And we use a bit of Gartner methodology. There's a spreadsheet you can get off Gartner that helps you work out, you know, what your on-prem sort of cost units are and what your storage units are, and actually starts to get things into a metric, so you can start to see what a gig of RAM costs you on-prem. It's not 100% accurate, it's about 80% there. There's a few people do this in the analyst firms. Gartner provides two methods of doing it. But this is a really interesting one. So when you start to boil it down, you can actually get yourself into a position where you say, okay, that is going to cost me £1,542 a month on-prem to run that application. So the cost to service that application and its hardware and its software and its licensing is at that. And then we times it by 2. Typically, not every application might have DR, but you've got hardware at a secondary site, you've got storage at a secondary site, you've got co-location or a data center cost at a secondary site, you've got the operational overhead of managing all of that. So typically, you know, the methodology in the industry is that you would typically times that by 2, and actually it's usually a little bit more than 2 because there's an operational overhead of actually managing it, but making it for ease, I've just times it by 2. And that effectively gets you into a position, you know, that you add then test and development, for example, where you might be using your DR equipment to do that, but you may not be. You may have a test and development stack that's consuming licensing and SQL licensing and VMware licensing, you name it. And you can get yourself to a figure when you net it all out. And it's an arguable figure, but you can get yourself, for example, the application all in is at £4,626 per month. And that's using on-prem and using the industry standard on-prem calculators for working out chargeback and showback. You kind of move into cloud, and I'm using cloud on pay-as-you-go here, and I'll come back to that in a minute. Spec all those instances as they were out, you're at 3,700. So is it a strong enough business case? Potentially not. You know, there's only a few £100 difference. Is it really worth doing it? But that is just using vanilla, you know, using the calculator on the way. And a lot of people do this, and it's the worst thing you could physically do is try and size it off the calculator on the cloud provider's front end, because it doesn't take into account anything. So the first thing is there. is if we start to refactor the front end of that application. So instead of using the 2 virtual machines and migrate them in, we split them across 4 much smaller ones that he designed. It's a stateless web application service, so we can scale that out. Bearing in mind as well that in this model, load balancers are typically free or a negligible cost. So now it doesn't really matter whether you've got 2 or 4 or 20. You know, that's a service that is at a negligible cost with most cloud providers. And then you also bring your own licensing. So maybe if you're, public sector using the hybrid use benefit, or whether you're migrating your current license, you'd always take SQL license with you, for example. You're in a position there where when you start to net that out, that drops massively. And I've kept the application tier and the database tier exactly the same, but just changing the web front end into smaller instances, but more of them, and taking your licensing with you, you can automatically see that when you start to delve into how you'd architect, and that's just at 1 tier, it's significantly cheaper there. You then want to add DR. Well, I've used a bit of a Rolls-Royce product, really, Cloud Endure. Not the cheapest product on the market, but good, does multi-cloud disaster recovery between regions and between cloud providers as well. So if you really want to go multi-cloud for your disaster recovery, but I've just used Cloud Endure because it is the most expensive. You add another £673 a month for that licensing, and then another £476 a month for, maybe 8 hours a day of test and dev for 2 or 3 days a week, whatever that may be. And you get yourself into a position where you're netting out at about $2.5 grand all in. So you can start to see that, you can make cloud look really expensive if you do it in an inefficient way and you don't optimize all the way in. But if you do it properly, and that's not really using cloud native functionality, that's just making some very small tweaks, really looking into licensing, but going further than the cloud provider's calculator, which is online. We're typically seeing the market is quite comfortable now with people who've done data center migrations into cloud at about a 30% TCO saving. It's becoming a common figure. A lot of the organizations that are speaking quite openly out there that they've done this are typically using figures of around 30% of what they've actually seen when they've done it. That doesn't take into account anything like, we've just had Azure reserved instances, for example, so you're at 60% saving if you actually buy that compute down. So you CapEx a little bit of it up front, and that allows you to effectively then bring the monthly cost down. So if you know you're going to have that application for 1, 2, 3 years, if you reserved instance, you'll get that 1,500 quid maybe down to 700 at that point. Turning off on use times, we do this in cloud. People think you don't, you just leave it running. Why would I ever turn it off? But if the application lends itself quite well to being able to do that, we will turn it off if it's not being used. If there's certain use times that it just doesn't need to be up, it's maybe not a tier 1 application, we'll do that. Ongoing optimization, Microsoft released new instances, which are twice the CPU for half the price. So at that point, when a new instance type comes out that does exactly that takes advantage of Moore's law, you're obviously not bound into hardware, so we would just switch the instances at that point, and that would effectively bring the bill down. So as long as you're ongoing optimization, making sure that you're on the right type of instances, and if you actually can get yourself into serverless architectures, things like PaaS, using maybe, I know a lot of application vendors, certainly in healthcare, don't necessarily support Azure SQL yet, which is why I've not used it as an example. But if you can do that, and you can re-architect your application into a serverless, you can get up to an 80% saving there. And we've seen customers that were running an application that was costing £2,000 a month, re-architecting into serverless, and it now coming out at £250 a month when you sort of take the VM away. So it's really important to not focus on VMs in the cloud and to focus on apps and app architecture. It's absolutely key. Another myth, cloud isn't secure. I actually think the people who think this now are in a minority. A couple of years ago, I wouldn't have said so, but the cloud providers have got more, certifications now than you can shake a stick at. Microsoft, again, announcing over $1 billion a year on cybersecurity on their cloud platforms. Many people are comfortable with Office 365, Salesforce, and some of those other sort of cloud-based applications, which have got relational structured data that, is something that's easily searchable by a cloud provider if they really wanted to, for example. But certainly delving into Microsoft security operations procedures that we've done quite significantly for many customers in many industries. Actually, when you sort of get the EBC maybe over in Dublin, or you speak to the right security people, you'll be actually surprised at the operational capability of how it's really impossible to actually rebuild a customer's environment with one person in Microsoft. It's just not structured like that. So from a security perspective, it's not just the accreditations and standards, it's that operationally the teams at Microsoft aren't structured in any way to be able to piece a customer environment back together from one point. And if you're lucky enough one day to maybe get the EBC, when they talk to you about security, compliance and accreditations and how the operations work, certainly in something like the Azure cloud, you'll understand what I mean by that, and it won't just be a few stamps. You'll actually understand how operations works and how much control the customer does actually have. But in terms of, I don't know any NHS trusts or public sector organisations that have got $1 billion a year on cyber security and teams of people in countries that are watching for malicious behaviour. It really is. It really is quite advanced. So I think that's starting to go now, and I think that we're starting to see that stigma disappear that cloud's not secure, which is, some people get it mixed up with sovereignty, which is a completely different topic entirely. But just in standard things, cloud not being secure, I think now is starting to be debunked as a myth. If you can get yourself into serverless environments, when you start to build in serverless, you sort of take away the attack surface of the operating system. So if you can, an application that might run on 20 operating systems, and you can get the SQL and some of the web front end, for example, in a complete serverless PaaS-based architecture, you can sometimes reduce your attack surface by up to 2/3, if not all the way, with some applications. And that just means you're not patching those, you're not having to worry about, operational procedures on patching those applications. They're effectively offline, those operating systems. And for that perspective, you're in a position where you're really reducing your attack surface now from a security perspective when you start to come out of the VM. So again, some applications I understand are a bit difficult to do that, certainly in healthcare, but where we can do it, we must start doing that way to reduce the attack surface, because it makes a big operational difference. And if you start to look at cloud native application functionality, because of the way that they're structured, and anybody who is sort of pretty affair with Azure, you'll see configuration-based vulnerabilities with automation start to, because you take the human out and you start to script and it starts to become repeatable, you lose some of those vulnerabilities. Zero-day malware is a lot more difficult, unauthorized access a lot more difficult, and unpatched exploits are a lot more difficult, because it's something that actually is not in your operational control. It's actually you're managing the application layer that's pushing into an offline operating system. So at that point, there's a real big reduction in attack surface. Cloud cannot host mission-critical apps, another myth. Well, the interesting thing here, I'd say, with cloud and mission-critical is about 4 or 5 years ago, definitely, service levels and the ability in certain public clouds. I wouldn't say there was loads and loads of outages, but there were certainly areas in which certain regions may not adhere to a typical 4 nines uptime, for example, or nowhere near a 5 nines uptime. And that wasn't really competing, or it left people really uncomfortable when they have mission critical applications of, is the cloud, is a hyperscale cloud environment something that I should be going to? And I'll be quite frank, I evangelized a little bit about this in 2012 when people were putting non-cloud native apps into cloud native environments, and my advice was be careful. And I actually did a presentation on it at the time that was, don't just throw it up there. There's a reason why it's not called a virtual machine and it's called an instance. And there is some identification differences there where you've got to make sure that, if you're on the wrong type of instance, you can potentially lose some data if the instance goes offline, and if it isn't designed correctly. So don't just treat it like a traditional ESX estate or a Hyper-V estate. It is slightly different. So there was a little bit of buyer beware. But again, it's another stigma that seems to be disappearing, and just pulling this off Cloud Harmony. And if anyone goes onto cloudharmony.com, it will give you all the uptimes of all the services. So it's basically a free monitoring. It got bought by Gartner not long ago. But it gives you sort of the service levels that the cloud services, regions, and it breaks it down into each different service of what the uptimes are up to, and that's from 2016. But you can see here, even in 2016, so this has only been taken about 18 months ago, most services there are 100%. And the one blip there you've got in Australia East, which nobody would be using anyway in this part of the world, you're sort of well over 4 nines and a 5, which is on par with enterprise service levels anyway. So from that perspective, I think that's starting to disappear now. There is an element, though, where you should always be designing for failure. So from a tip perspective, using ephemeral servers where possible, making sure that you don't store state on the server. If you can design that out, there's services in cloud that you can actually start to dump that data to that are much more persistent and better than just having them written onto an operating system, using containers. If you are doing in-house development or having somebody develop for you, developing into microservices where you can build in bulkheads, building loosely coupled applications with eventual consistency, and all these will build further and further resilience and tolerance into the application. And you're now starting to see the traditional monolith applications starting to be designed in a cloud-native way for cloud to even mitigate any of that risk even further. Which brings me on to another one. Cloud is for cloud-native apps only. Well, It's cheaper if you're in a cloud-native application environment. Yes, it is. It's definitely cheaper, it's definitely less operational overhead, and it's definitely nicer and lends itself to change a lot better than a traditional monolith. But I don't really want to sort of advocate that, you know, those applications, if you're talking that maybe 30% of your estate can't move because it's a traditional monolith, I would say that maybe the cost gains of you know, coming out of that operational model and out of that data center, even if you're moving a big, you know, chunky application, monolith, big database, you know, huge RAM, huge CPU, moving that into cloud, it can be dearer to move that into the cloud than maybe what you're paying on-prem, but as an actual project of a total cost of ownership of the whole environment, it still won't eat in or make it more expensive. So sometimes you'll save on one application and it might go on to another application, but as a net out of it as a whole environment, it's certainly moving, lifting and shifting applications may actually be, you know, a really good way to evacuate a data center. So you don't have to re-architect absolutely everything. So just for those traditional monoliths, you've got a huge family of instances out there, you know, over 10, 15 different types of compute and instances that you've got in the cloud that lend themselves really well. You know, you've got some instances in the cloud that are hundreds megabytes of RAM and CPU with, you know, hundreds of thousands of IOPS behind them that you just couldn't get with on-prem systems, not at a good cost point. And even if you only needed to, you know, use one of those instances for a month of the year for whatever that may be, or a time of the day, it does give you the ability to move between different types of instances that you wouldn't typically do on-prem. We see some customers that actually have said, we've got this traditional application, it's quite a monolith, it's big, it's chunky, it's old, but by moving it to cloud, what it's given us is the ability to just tinker and refactor with it. And maybe you wanted a search function in that application. Well, things like search functions in an application, you may not have that on-prem or even the tooling or even the skills to do that. But in cloud, it's quite easy to sort of build a module, really straightforward, and add search into an application to search a database or search whatever that may be. So you can actually start to build some new services around these old applications that give them a bit more value than what you get on-prem. That's becoming quite common now, that if we just lift and shifted this app into the cloud, we could actually add some of the cloud features to this data and to this type of application. It gives us incredibly agile test environments. It's much easier to evolve and develop the app just because of the tool chain that you get in cloud. And actually, don't turn your nose up at it, because it can actually give you, it can repay on a business case quite quicker, because lifting and shifting some apps without tinkering with them actually is quite quick to migrate. So although it's better to do it if you can, don't be put off and think to yourself now in 2018 that I can't move this huge monolith. There's a lot of tooling out there that can help move it, and actually it could be something that gets a cloud migration under the way quicker if that's something that you're interested in doing. So going on all of this to find out how do I do that and what does it look at, performing a full assessment is key. The cloud migrations that we've been involved in have had a really light touch assessment, not understanding the applications first, not understanding who uses them, how they use them, what the risk profile is. You know, doing a full assessment is something I would absolutely advocate. We do it, there's other people that do it, but always make sure you go into it with an assessment. You know, we did 28 of these assessments last year for customers. It's a big growing part of our business, but it effectively maps out the whole DNA of the environment, leaves no stone unturned. So then when we do migrate and we off-prem your applications into the cloud, we know exactly which ones we can refactor, we know what we can use cloud native, what's high risk, what's low risk, where are the quick wins, what does the business case look like, am I going to get 30% TCO, is it more, is it less? You've really got to do that work, and the one we've been involved in is where somebody's been sold a cloud application migration tool on a license, they've installed it and then literally just moved the VM as is, and then when it's all in there, it's costing £80,000–90,000 a month, and they think, my God, this is expensive. An assessment is absolutely key, because some apps you'll move as is, and a lot of apps we can actually just tinker with them as they move in to make them half the price. It's such a big swing in a business case, just whatever you do, always go in with a full assessment. You'll see something called the 6 R's. I'll send these slides around anyway, or Charlotte will send them around, so don't worry about that. But you'll see there's some common application migration strategies, and they actually start with R. We use this methodology. You've got rehost, which applications am I lifting and shifting, gives us a fast migration, and it helps us with compelling events like I want to turn the data center off, or I don't want to have to refresh the hardware that those apps are sat on. Replatform is a bit of a tinkering. We might optimize it in flight, like I showed before, change the instances. You know, I might start moving the SQL to SQL DB, or Azure DB, or Azure SQL, sorry, to be honest, and to just get rid of that SQL overhead and that patching and that management overhead. So we might actually say, actually, let's let's go straight into the PaaS platform. It might be an upgrade of an operating system. There's various different things that we can do there in a replatform. We've got Repurchase. You might actually go, this application actually is now going to force us, because it won't run in cloud, we need to use a new application. So we see traditional, not so much in healthcare, but traditional CRM systems moving to Salesforce at that point, because if something's holding you back from a brand new operational model and that vendor doesn't support it, again, I understand it's difficult in some public sector and healthcare organisations and many verticals, to be honest, but where we can repurchase on the way and move to SaaS and just completely get rid of the operational capability, that is something that we would advocate as well. Excuse me. Refactoring. So this is now where we're starting to maybe rebuild some of the code. You've got the source code, it was built in-house, and now is a good time to refactor and maybe spend some money on refactoring that application for cloud and moving from a monolith to a service-orientated application. There's a lot of that going on. That is a huge market. There's companies that just do that. We bought a company that does that in December to help us with customers that have got traditional applications and how do we re-architect them and re-platform them for cloud. About 10 to 20% of applications, believe it or not, what we find in our assessments, aren't even being used. They've just sat there, you know, and this is sometimes a lack of an application portfolio management strategy. There are, typically, I think the figure, if I spoke to Chris Mills in our enterprise architecture department, about 10% of applications actually we can just retire. They're just not being used anymore or don't really add the value or would be very easy to retrofit into something else. And then there are applications that maybe you've just made an investment in and the hardware investment on that you need to retain and just run out as is. There's no point moving it. There's an asset that we need to depreciate. It doesn't work out from a business case perspective. So you can kind of get your apps into one of those sort of 6 categories, and then that goes into sort of a quadrant that gives us an idea of, you know, what a migration looks like and how they should be moved and where we can be focusing. So typically the size of the bubble here is how costly the application is to run. So you can kind of see, and this matches in with the Gartner time analysis, which sort of gives you the tolerate, invest, migrate, and eliminate quadrants. So, you know, getting that sort of justification you can see on the landscape where the apps sort of net out is really valuable in an assessment. To the next tip. If you can adopt aggressively, do it. Now, people say, well, we're going to dip our toe in and we're going to move over a number of years, and that's absolutely fine if there's an operational way or, you know, there's an operational reason as to doing that. Maybe it's the risk appetite, maybe it's people just want to one button. There are lots of people doing that. What I kind of just want to say is be careful about riding 2 horses at once and just understand that, you know, to have half of your infrastructure in cloud, half of your infrastructure on-prem, you can easily miss deadlines on things like evacuating hardware where you've got to refresh, you know, maybe quite costly hardware when actually there's a plan to move it to cloud. So I think what I'm saying here is, although you might be risk averse and you might think that's a really stupid tip, adopting aggressively, if you look at someone like Staffordshire Uni who adopted aggressively within 12 months, that's how they got the savings, that's how the business case worked. So sort of saying I'm going into cloud and we're going into cloud and not just going to play with it over the next 5 years, that if you have made that operational shift, because you don't really want to be managing a huge cloud environment and also one that's left on-prem, because you sort of got almost the worst of both worlds though. So I understand that, you know, there are reasons why that needs to be happening, but I think if you can adopt aggressively to get your applications in there, then adopt aggressively if that's something that we can physically do. But I understand the appetite of certain people may not, but you will find better returns that way without an absolute doubt. And you'll also get a better cost advantage with the cloud provider as well. Which leads me on to the next tip. Be very careful of defaulting to hybrid as a strategy. Now, hybrid has become one of those things, hybrid cloud, that's, whether it's buzzword or whatever people's, you know, everyone's got a different opinion on it, but people are basically saying that there's old stuff on-prem that I've got that I'm going to run out, and there's new stuff that I'm going to build in cloud, which is absolutely fine. And what I would always say is, why do we have old stuff? Now, I know there might be hosted applications or centrally bought applications or applications that are bound into many systems, but if they're old and they're an operational nightmare to look after, I think basically what we're saying is there's a lot of success happening, certainly in central government, with redeveloping the way out of those traditional and old applications. And actually, it's not acceptable to have, it's not about just having on-prem systems, it's about having old systems that are insecure on-prem. And there's a mindset shift, and a lot of people sometimes are, you know, they're very operationally heavy in the IT department and very light on development. And actually, we're seeing a lot of success with organisations who are flipping it the other way, certainly in central government, who are starting to get a better balance between development and operations and starting to embrace things like DevOps principles in a way to actually develop out of the old systems and maybe build something new internally that's a much more fit for purpose, much more modern, much more easily to change, and a lot less risk, a lot less costly to run. So I think it's easy when you ask most people, what's your strategy? And they go, oh, it's hybrid. And then you sort of say, why? It's like, well, old on-prem and new in cloud. I would just be very careful of that. It can be very costly to do that. I think there's a state where hybrid is a transition period, 100%, and that transition period could be a year, it could be 10 years. But by just defaulting to saying it'll be hybrid because I've got this old stuff and the new stuff, looking at the applications, it's becoming less acceptable to run old, you know, legacy systems and just run those out till they rot. There's a lot of really old systems out there in public sector, in healthcare, that just really need to be got a grip of and just really need to be rebuilt. And I understand, again, yeah, it's difficult, but we have got projects where we're building new systems in front of the old data and migrating over, so it's not completely impossible. I believe you can dev your way out of most stuff with enough budget in the right area and enough will. So I'm just saying be careful about just answering by default of it's hybrid. It can be costly to do that, and it can land you sort of, as the last slide showed, riding two horses. You've always got the cost of the final server. It's never just the server. You've got switchgear, you've got racks, you've got, you name it, you've got all this equipment, and you might have to maintain some equipment there if you're, you know, there are local services that you want to keep on-prem, of course, definitely, if that's the case. And certainly in healthcare, there are those systems without a doubt. But just making sure that it's not just the server and the license. You've now got a network that you've got power over. You need a core switch that's £70,000, £80,000 a time. You know, you've got the skills that you need for that core networking capability. So from that perspective, you know, it's not just about those final servers. It's about, you know, other teams as well that may dovetail in that can be quite expensive to run the surrounding infrastructure. Which kind of leads me to another one. Myth, cloud means no ops, and you're going to hear this a little bit out there. We do no ops, we have no operations. Well, it's interesting that really, because I think that some people can't see that it's not that there's no operations, it's just operations is very different. So I'll give you a couple of examples. Cloud providers give you 200, 300, 400 services on demand, and they're very easy to use because when you start to use them and you see the value in them, you know, just putting a monolithic application in there and then building search functionality, for example, is a prime example. It can get quite expensive. It can open up a lot of security challenges if you don't know that service really well and how it should be architected. And I sort of liken it to a little bit of a minibar. This is from when I went on holiday last year, actually, that you come back with the children quite early because your kids need to go down to sleep, and then before you know it, you've had a beer, you've had a gin and tonic, you've had God knows what else is in there, and before you know it, you get the bill at the end, and it's quite expensive, and it's a lot of little things that can add up to quite a lot. So really, operations is focused really on governance as code. You know, a lot of what we do as an organisation is coding governance in to make sure that we give people the freedom to create systems, to be able to develop, to be able to test. But actually there's government, you know, there's fuses in there and there's trip switches in there that make sure that people can't do things that would effectively, so you're democratising some of the cloud functionality, but it's coded in that you can't do the things that operations don't allow. So at that point there's trip switches and there's fuses and whatever you want to call it. Keeping standards and consistency, cost control is a huge, and building automation. You know, you can automate your way with a function. With, you know, function-based compute is so powerful. You can do some amazing things in cloud with function-based compute. And operations there has some really, really good value to add in cloud. And cloud operations is very different, but it still exists. It is still operations. So, and I think that people think that you hand all that to Microsoft or Amazon or Google or whoever that is, and the fact of the matter is you really don't. You don't. It just changes a little bit. It becomes lighter touch, it becomes a lot faster, it becomes much more agile, but it's just a different skill set. But we would always say, you know, when you get operations or people that aren't operational or have operational capability in the cloud, you do end up with things not being backed up, things being really expensive. You know, you end up with cloud buckets which have no passwords on them, no for multi-factor authentication. You know, you're really bad design, you're backing everything up when you don't need to. We see it quite a lot when operations isn't being done properly. So, you know, or even down into security. So, you know, it's a complete and utter myth that, you know, there's even this thing called no operations. You will find some Web 2.0 companies where the developers do the operations as well. Those people are incredibly hard to find, really expensive, and they usually get swapped up by the Web 2.0. And what you'll find is a lot of developers, for example, or a lot of application owners don't want to do the ops. It's not of interest to them. They're not interested. So I believe that to be a myth from what we see of all the systems and migrations that we do in cloud. This is a prime example taken from a live customer. Migration, December 2015, starts to get, 15,000 a month, just coming up to 20,000 a month, February 2016 up and over, and you can see the virtual machines are being migrated in at that point, and we've got some pace there, so you're starting to get from December to April, 4 months, and you get down to August and you can see you're approaching nearly 70,000, this is actually in dollars a month. It's expensive, right? You take on a service at that point, you start cloud optimization, you start cloud engineering, you start rebuilding things properly, and before you know it, from August to November, and that was actually, and there is a little bit of a selling here, so sorry about that, but what more I'm selling is cloud operations and ANS, so please forgive me. But when that customer started an operational service with us in August 2016, by the time in November, we were down to about 23,000, 24,000 a month for exactly the same environment. So from 70 all the way down to 23 for the same environment. That is where, you get to a point in August 2016 when you go, wow, this is really expensive. And this is where you're just migrating virtual machines in as they are on-prem into the cloud. But actually, that environment's $23,000, $24,000, $25,000 a month to run for the whole environment. It was 73 or 4 before. So you can see how cloud gets this bad name of it's expensive. And if you do it properly, it's just not. It's just skills, it's expertise, it's guidance, it's governance. It's all the things that we've all been used to. So that is a live snapshot that we use quite a lot. And that runs me into, don't fear the MSP or the cloud services provider. There's a lot of technical pool and a lot of technical ability that you have in a cloud services provider. We've got a team of 30 that are certified in public cloud, which will be very difficult for anyone to recruit themselves. It's not a managed service in the traditional sense. It is an extension to your team. It's making sure that you integrate the services properly. You have somebody that can write scripts and code for your operations. The services are usually a percentage of your bill. That's how they typically work. That's what the market does. But there's a lot of value. It's a $20 billion market by 2020 because purely there's a lot of people moving to cloud who don't necessarily have the skills. So don't fear the cloud services provider. That market out there adds a hell of a lot of value to do exactly what was on the last slide, to get you from 70K a month down to 25. So it's a completely validated market. So a few takeaways then, just wrapping up now, right on the nose. Find the right mindset. There are some people, if you can't change the people, which is a really interesting one, that you've got to have people in the team that want to do this, that want to make it work, that want to really embrace the cloud and sort of lose some of the protection barriers. Make sure you're designing for efficiency. Traditionally you're designing for risk, but you've got to be risk and efficiency. It's all about efficiency in the cloud. Make sure you do a full assessment to assess your apps. Develop a good roadmap of how you're going to do it, the rehost, retire, full application portfolio management, and make sure you invest in the operational capability of people who've done it before. You'll be surprised what you can learn. Access to that wider technical pool is absolutely key. The next webinar is with Joanna from Royal Brompton and Herfield, NHS. They're sort of halfway into an Azure migration. We manage the customer's environment for them, so there's there's a lot of Azure expertise that we've got there. So we're helping these guys. You'll see a press release. So we've got real-world experience of healthcare, and Joanna's a great advocate as well, and she's really phenomenal to spend some time with. So please join us for that. And I just thought I'd open it up to sort of questions and answers, really, and I'll just see if there's anything that's on the WebEx maybe, or any questions, Charlotte. No, so I'll just give it a minute if that's okay, and if anybody wants to post a question, that'd be great. And I'll take any questions for the next 30 seconds. If not, then we'll leave you to get on with the day. Oh, doesn't look like it there. Well, thanks very much, everyone. Hopefully I've answered some things, and if there's a few nuggets in there that you can take away, and if you want to contact me, I'm andy.barrow@ans.co.uk, so you can get the details of our marketing, Andy_Barrow on Twitter. So if there's anything at all that you want to discuss, then I'd be delighted to help you out. Thanks very much, and have a great day.